put
Thank
myself in
you.
it.
Well, this is a great pleasure. I'm always pleased to any opportunity to talk about Paul Sandby, who is a figure that who has kind of occupied my thoughts for at least the past 10 years and more, probably more like 15 now, which is a horrendous thought. And this drawing that I'm going to be talking about in particular has kind of been in my mind for all those years too. And I've begun to think about it very differently over that period of time. So my talk today is going to be focused on Paul Sandby's view near Loch Rannoch, a drawing dated 1749. And as I was just saying, it's a really small work, approximately 17 by 23 centimeters, as you can see. So it's a kind of near miniature. It's also unfinished. There's passages of blank paper, and it's also far from pristine in condition. There's tears in it that you can see, and foxing. It's not great condition. It's all of this makes it seem rather unprepossessing, but it's an image which has wide currency, indeed far beyond that of grander examples of landscape art of the period. Indeed, it's been reproduced many times, used as a jacket illustration and as a frontispiece, most recently in Old Ways, New Roads, travels in Scotland, 1720 to 1832. And here I might just say that this was the choice of the designer who did such a wonderful job on the book, not the editors. It wasn't my idea or Anne's or Nigel's. But once the suggestion was made, it seems a rather obvious one. It's an arresting and richly associative image, and one that makes, I think, themes central to the book and the exhibition vivid. It's a picture, as we'll see, about observation and depiction, as well as the roles of mapping and improvement in the transformation of the Scottish landscape in the years after the Jacobite risings of the first half of the 18th century. And it's for these reasons, too, that the work is central to the arguments of what's the first section of the book and will be the first section of the exhibition, which explores Scotland as a theatre of war. And it's also why I've kind of singled the drawing out for discussion today. Now, the view near Loch Rannoch, or how it's currently catalogued by the British Library, who own it, Surveying Party by Kinloch Rannoch, owes its renown to its connection to the military survey of Scotland, or the so-called Great Map. That is the large-scale mapping of the country, which was undertaken by the Board of Ordnance shortly after the defeat of the Jacobite cause at Culloden. And indeed, examples of the map, the Great Map, were central to the opening section of Old Ways, New Roads. Now, the military survey, as I'm sure many of you will know, was part of a broader strategy of pacification in the Highlands, alongside the construction of the extensive road network begun some 20 years or so earlier under General Wade, and which is, of course, the starting point, as we heard last week from Anne, for Old Ways, New Roads. Showing a surveying party at work in the Southern Highlands, Sandby's drawing is often reproduced in studies of the military survey and its chief architects, Colonel David Watson and William Roy. And in such studies, the drawing is usually treated, I think, as essentially documentary, as a on-site record, as it were, of a party in action. And by extension, for instance, the figure at the center of the image, at the theodolite, taking a reading or sighting, is usually assumed to be William Roy. On close scrutiny, however, and I think it is an image that repays close scrutiny, Sandby's drawing is less the kind of relatively straightforward matter of fact it's sometimes taken to be, and which I think I may have been guilty of thinking it was when I first wrote about it 10 years ago. It's something more complex, perhaps. I think it's evaluative as much as documentary, and less maybe about how things were and more about the potential of the landscape, um, its capabilities, to use a kind of 18th century idea. Now, in 1749, dates of a view near Loch Rannoch, Sandby, who was just 18 at the time, was part of the Ordnance Drawing Room, which is based in Edinburgh Castle. During the summer months, he accompanied surveying parties, but his main role was as what was called the chief draftsman of the fair plan, collating field measurements and sketches made in the field during the summer months and undertaking some of the graphic work, notably the relief sketching with the main, while the main engineer and surveyor, William Roy, probably supplied some of the fine detail and lettering. The detail I'm showing you here, for instance, at the bottom, comes from a strip of the map showing the area around Loch Rannoch, and where you can see the kind of relief work that Sandby was responsible for, this highly painterly and distinctly virtuoso-like style of terrain drawing in pen and wash, where aligned brushstrokes indicate the direction of slopes and graduation of tones to suggest steepness and height. It's highly decorative and also extremely innovative in terms of the production of map making in the period. And you can also see this same style of hatch-like marks, for instance, in Sandby's drawing of Loch Rannoch, notably in the hillsides. Indeed, that drawing also shares the same limited palette that you see in the Great Map. Now, according to an early memoir of Sandby, his time working on the military survey of Scotland was supposedly, quote, the source of his eminence as a landscape painter, where he saw nature in her wildest form, but also where the particular accuracy in filling up plans, that is, drawing up the map, may be supposed to have formed in him that correct and faithful habit with which after he viewed and delineated her. Map making, in other words, provided Sandby with a kind of model for expanding the scope of his art, for laying out information about land and life in a particular place, as well as its coordinates with a wider world. But also, like maps, let's go back, I think, to the image. Like maps, works of pictorial art helped project as well as document change in the landscape. Now, it's not quite clear, I think, why Sandby produced the view near Loch Rannoch, and indeed, or why he then abandoned it. But it may have been a kind of frontispiece of some sort, commemorative of the military survey and its achievements. It does seem to be, as I want to suggest, more emblematic than documentary. Going in close, for instance, to the group at the center of the image, they seem lined up in a highly formal, symmetrical way. The surveying party appears to be something other than a kind of functional unit engaged in some rapid reconnaissance, taking hasty measurements and sightings in an area which was still dangerous at the time, where it had seen a great deal of fighting. Accompanying the surveyor, who we might assume to be Roy at the theodolite, are two escorting redcoats and also two Highlanders, local guides or interpreters perhaps, though their demeanour and dress may suggest otherwise. At far right, striking a standard pose of gentlemanly ease and refinement with one foot forward and his hand on his hip, the Highlander seems to have stepped more out of a contemporary conversation piece as anything. Only it's a conversation piece perhaps in which the theodolite takes the place of the usual telescope on a terrace overlooking fine parkland. Indeed, that the group as a whole might be best understood in emblematic terms as representative of the grander civilizing, modernizing post-rebellion project of which the military survey formed part, also offers some explanation for the otherwise strangely incongruous, almost comic sight of the elegant female figure in full formal gown to the far left. In this sense, it's striking that the measuring chain being dragged by the two figures across the ground in the middle of the picture are silhouetted against blank paper. And a reminder perhaps of the sheets on which the new view of the land being projected was to be inscribed. Interestingly, the site of this drawing lies on lands which had been confiscated from the Jacobite Robertsons of Struan and placed under the control of Board of Annexed Estates, a Westminster appointed body, whose progressive plans for reshaping the economy and society of the Highlands was to see the establishment at Loch Rannoch of a model settlement for discharged soldiers and displaced crofters. Here we show a map by John Leslie of the map, which is in its cartouche clearly labelled as one of His Majesty's annexed estates in North Britain. To return then to surveying party by Loch Rannoch, we might see the drawing as reflecting then on the progressive forces and interests remaking the Scottish landscape at this point, on their implications for this place and more widely. It's a view of the landscape not so much as it was, but as it will be almost, or as it should be. But by way of conclusion, we might therefore ask what became of the investments in this place that are registered in Sandby's drawing, by turning to what Thomas Pennant, the Welsh naturalist and traveller, had to say about the progress of this landscape some 20 years down the line. Writing of the Board of Annexed Estates in his pioneering tour of Scotland, Pennant was approving of, quote, the rare patriotism it had shown, readily endorsing the great object of its enterprise to promote the values of Anglican worship, good government, industry, manufactures, and the principles of loyalty to the present royal line. Signs of the board's activities were evident in the landscape, in the construction of new bridges, roads, and settlements. But he was forced to acknowledge that some of these already lay in ruin, concluding that the board's, quote, utopian project of establishing colonies on the forfeited estates by no means answered the intentions of the projectors. At Loch Rannoch, Pennant found that the, quote, veteran soldiers who were settled here after the peace of 1748, as soon as the money was spent, left their tenements to be possessed by the next comer. Georgetown, as the settlement was to be christened, was abandoned along with its royal name. And I'll stop there.